I know there's a few folks that are out today because they're sick or they're traveling, so we'll get started early. Whoa. What's up with my display? Uh-oh. Guess so. Is the projector finally dead? I don't know what's going on.
Teddy, I think probably a bit early because I'll have to sit around for a long time waiting for the train.
That's fine. When's your train?
My train will be at 9, so I'd leave at
Okay. It's fine. For the folks tuning in online, sorry, hold on. We're having AV issues. What do you see that? Uh-oh.
Wait, is Tim here?
Sorry?
Is Tim here?
That's a good question. It's phasing out.
Literally.
Yeah. So much for starting early. Hang tight, guys, whoever's online. Oh, I saw flash.
All right. You just need like a, can you get like a tape?
Yeah.
Well, is anybody sitting there now?
Nope.
All right.
You're going.
Yeah. Shit, no. I don't want to do that. We'll put it with the
Let's try to figure it.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
There we go.
Okay, yeah, it looks a little skewed though.
Yeah.
I do it.
Okay, it's better.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys work with this? Yeah, we can work with this.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I'll make some large text, so it's not a worry.
All right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, high resolution. Oop. Okay. So if you guys pull the code, lesson 16, we have a project, in-class project called Feeder. So I want to open this up. So lesson 16. Oh, it's not 15. 16. Starter code. So go ahead and copy this whole folder in your classwork folder so you can work from it.
We have the cheat sheet in lesson 16 before, is that?
I'm sorry? That was a previous lesson, not this one. So I'm gonna paste this in my downloads. There we go, here. So let's go ahead and open this up. And while you guys download this, there's a few things we're gonna cover today. So we started working with APIs last time, right? An SQL session. How are you guys feeling with that? What do we need? What are the requirements for making an API call? Let's take a step back. What's the library we use? NS.
This URL session.
Yep, and URL session is a classic call to make calls. So there's, I would say, about 3 steps, right? So first step for an URL session is a requirement. What's the requirement for us to plug in there? So every time we make a call, we make a call somewhere, right? So what do we have to tell it? We make the place, right? And that's in the form of what kind of type?
String.
So we put it as a string, but we have to type guess something else. Yeah, you're right.
And that's URL.
NS URL, right? So before we pass an NS, before we start an NS URL session, we pass in the URL, the location we're connecting to, in the form of an NS URL. Okay, step number 2 is, what's step number 2?
The completion handler.
Completion handler, right? So what goes in the completion handler?
Data response and error.
Yeah, so we have data, we have the data, the response and the error. So in terms of the overall things that happen in our application, what happens, what do we do in our, in this little block of completion handler.
So they don't remind it. You say on our website, it's like.
We do stuff with it, right? That's where we actually get data back. That's where we actually do stuff with it, right? Do you guys remember how what part of this is asynchronously and what happens in the main queue? So we can review this because this one is a bit trickier. So all the processes, or most of the processes we've been learning so far, are kind of like a main queue, right? Or main kind of interface. So we've been looking at the Git model as kind of like a tree, right? So we have this master branch, this master highway, right? And so far, most of the stuff we've been doing, working with data, changing text color, changing background color, we're doing that directly up here. This is our main queue, our main row. Now, whenever we make connections to the server, best practice for that is to not do it in the main queue, because if we try and make a connection from here, wait for the server to come back and do something with it, everything's gonna get held over here. Everything here happens in functional order, right? So if the user presses like load data or like, the Twitter refresh, right? You pull down and starts refreshing. If the data was happening in this queue, after the user pulled it, it would just get stuck there. You wouldn't be able to navigate and keep playing around with Twitter, right? So that's how this kind of, it's called the Grand Central Dispatch, GCD. That's how it works. Whenever you use NSURL session, it automatically starts a different queue. And this car basically makes the connection to the server. We get the data back, right? We have to turn back here. And after it's ready, it then tells us in our main queue, in that block, that our data is ready. So inside the block of NSURL session, this is where we update our main interface, right? So wait for data to come back from our side queue to here for us to be able to execute this, right? So with NSURL session, that happens automatically. We don't have to worry. We don't have to explicitly say, hey, take another thread and start making those connections in our thread. We can do that through the other NS connection, but that's a lot more steps. It's a lot less robust. It doesn't give us all the tools this gives us. And the asynchronous part of this is the biggest benefit, right? It happens for us on a different thread, so we don't have to worry about bouncing things back and forth from queues and different threads, right? It's automated for us. So if you hear the term Grand Central Dispatch, that's what it is. It's essentially this queuing system that happens of things passing back to our main queue, right? Most of the time, thus far, we've only been working in our main queue. Does that make sense? So in that block of NSURL session, this code essentially executes as soon as we get data back from the thing. Right? Clear? Not getting questions on that? So we get the data back, and the data is usually in what kind of format? Bytecode. So we have to convert it, right? And usually we're going to be working with JSON data, right? So after we get the data back, then we can start assigning the data to things. Or we can either model our data or start refreshing our views with the data that comes back, right? So say we go through all this logic, we're going to focus on this part today, on updating our views from the data. There's one more step at the very end of NSURL session, which is none of this will run unless what's each thing?
All you have to do is task resume.
Task resume, right? And task is the middle thing, what we're doing. Every time we start an NSURL section, that's the nomenclature for that. It's called task, right? So the keyword of task or resume doesn't have to be task. It's just best practice for us to name it a some form of task. So by default, our API call will not run unless we do resume, right? This is a good thing. It's an extra step, but it's a good thing because it gives us full control when we call this data and when we pause it and when we can resume it and do things with it, right? So having an extra step there is a good thing. Now, last class, one of the things that we were really practicing was we're going down the chain of JSON, right? Why was it a pain in the ass?
So you have to go to the API and find out what the data type everything is, go down the ladder for the same.
You basically have to typecast everything, right? Check if it exists. Even though you know it exists, this swift way of unwrapping stuff is you have to check if it exists, right? Otherwise, you'll get an error. So we're gonna get a bit more proficient with it today, and then we're gonna start working with CocoaPods as an intro way to pull in a library that makes accessing the data a bit easier. So we don't have to do if-let statements every time. We can just do everything online, right?
You can do it, guys.
Yeah, last class is really just the idea to make you feel the pain. No, but it's important to understand how to do it natively. And then we're going to bring another CocoaPod, which is essentially like a slider. So you can learn to really implement external libraries, open source libraries to our projects.
When are we getting a homework that incorporates APIs?
This week. Yeah. Cool. Questions?
So today's what we would learn if we were just learning to hack.
Sorry?
Today is just what we would learn, what we would learn if we were learning to hack together the code without understanding what's going on.
What do you learn if you were to learn?
If you learn like a hacky way to do things.
We're learning like a tool to make it easier to do.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I'm not sure what you mean by hacking. Like,
I'll talk about that.
I think hacking.
Going around the fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
What?
Going a bit, hiding the fundamentals a little bit, which is totally fine.
Yeah, it's not hacking by any means, no. But it's kind of an API on top of an API, which makes things easier and I would say unstructured, but it's by no means hacking.
I think, did we start recording?
We did. What's going on?
You just asked me. We were still in trouble.
I'm gonna get the screen here a little bit lost. It's back there. Do you want to mess with this?
I think it's okay if you just make it display version.
Are you guys good with this? If I make it larger?
Yeah.
How's this? Good? Cool. So last class we started playing with two APIs, right? Reddit and Mashable. And we'll do most of today's class as a code along, and so you guys have a boilerplate so you can use it for your projects and for homework. So this class is mostly going to be follow along. So last class we started working with Reddit and Mashable APIs, right? We're able to pull titles from Mashable and Reddit. So this class, we're going to start with this feeder project, which basically will be what we started doing last class, but with a graphical user interface, so we can list all the articles and actually click into them to pull up the content of the article. So if you look at feeder, if you run this, so right now, all my content is coming from this array. And when you click into the content, it will load up a page of that content's site. So right now it's static. It's just pulling in my own personal unfinished crap. So a few things to note here. Number one, this format is familiar to us, right? We have a table view controller, right? Table view controller has an array of data. We count sections, we get the total array count, and we start populating each one of our items, right? We have one more thing here, which we haven't done before. We have a, on tap of a cell, we go to another page, another controller, and the controller we're using for this is a WebView controller. So WebView controller essentially is kind of like Safari, but without the header, right? That's all it is a WebKit window which spans full screen. So if you actually had a responsive site that you wanted to get on the App Store without rebuilding it, you can actually just have your app just be a WebView controller and just wrap the whole thing up there. So we learned to work with those. Essentially what's happening here is when you click on one of the cells in our storyboard, we go into this WebView controller over here. And really the WebView controller is just a normal view controller. We drag and drop it from our object finder here. And one more note, the way it works is we have to actually tie up just the web view to our controller, and then when our view loads, we have to load the web view with a URL, which is essentially in the form of NSURL request. So this is pretty standard. Every time you guys want to use a web view, all you really have to do is reference the web view in your view controller and just do self.webview, the load request, and the URL. So back in our table view controller, this is our did select row function. So basically when we tap on a row, we can tell it to do something. In this case, we're performing, we're switching through the segue, right? And the segue I named as web. And in there, we're passing we can pass things through there, through our performance segue, right? And we're passing an NSURL request type, which is basically a wrapped up NSURL string.
Did you just name it?
The what?
Did you just name the web view?
Nope. That's provided in the skeleton project you had. Questions so far?
About how you pass the URL in the segue. Is that something we've seen before? Is it something new?
So you haven't seen it before. You're passing it to the sender, and the sender in our web view, actually the sender is taking it here and prepare the segue hook, right? So we've worked with this one before, where you can see what the segue is and do stuff according to it. And in the segue, before you're switching, you're kind of working through in the delegation pattern when we found the view controller and then set the parameter in the view controller to whatever we're passing. Same thing's happening here. So we're saying destination view controller is this web view controller where we're going, right? And that view controller has a parameter called request. So if I go in my web view controller, over here I have a variable request, which is an optional. So over there I'm saying this request parameter that's available in my web view class, set that to request, which is the thing we're passing here, the sender. So if you wanted to not load a web view, passing from another from another screen, if you just wanted to have a web view, essentially, instead of having this, you would essentially have something like this over here, right? So you load a web view with the load request method that gets passed in the URL, right?
This way you can do it all programmatically and you wouldn't have to pull out the web view from.
Right. But what's happening here is this request. This is being sent from our view controller every time we are switching through the segue, right? Question on this functionality so far? Does it make perfect sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe this could replace delegation for us at some point.
I'm sorry?
I'm trying to wrap my head around how this passing data to the sender could replace delegation through via protocols.
Yeah, so
Good practice.
with this, all we're doing is passing one piece of data. With delegation, we're passing data and we're running something, right? So our task at hand initially is to connect to the Reddit API, pull all the data, populate each one of these articles with titles, and maybe we'll get crazy and even get like upvotes in there. Then when you click on a specific article, it takes us to the respective web view, which loads the full article within our app, right? A lot of feed readers, do you guys have any feed readers in your apps? A lot of them work like that. Even like Facebook and LinkedIn, when there's links that get shared within the network, that's what they do. They load the web view with the link that's passing to that web view. Cool? So let's get started with what we know. So we'll start with making our call to the Reddit API. So first thing we have to do is what?
Import the library that we're going to use. CocoaPods.
No, we're gonna do that after
Oh.
after our torturous endeavors.
So into the Reddit. Well, are we taking it from the main Reddit page, or?
Yep.
Are we taking it from
Yeah, the same
URL?
Reddit page we did before. Then we can change it later.
Oh.
So what's step number one?
If let URL equals NS URL parentheses string colon.
So why is this an optional?
Because we don't know if the page will be usable.
Exactly. We don't know if what we're inputting is an actual URL. So Xcode has to verify for us, or this library has URL to verify that it is a URL we can use. Okay. So what's next? So we have our URL. Where do we plug in the URL?
To create a task.
Yep. So we'll create a task. And the task is what type? URL session. Very good. That's shared session. We'll do data task with URL. And the URL. this URL, completion handler, then is data. Response, error. So what's next? We what? Create a variable to be. So what are we working with after we make this call?
We're working with UTF.
But which one of these parameters are we going to be using?
Data.
Data, right? Okay. So what's next?
So we call it like our title or something like that.
So how do we do it last time? Var my string.
How would you label it in more detail?
So you guys walk me through this. So what's the string? So let's actually open up the Reddit API first before we can move on. So oh, this was the one that had lots of fun twists and turns and loopholes. I mean, if you guys feel like you have a good understanding of unwrapping your JSON, we can go straight to the easier method.
I mean, I had a hard time with the one we were trying to do on our own in class.
What was the problem with it?
I was having trouble like translating why, like it just wasn't working.
I was having trouble too going down the different levels. Like understanding which one starts being a dictionary.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then you go down to an array.
Well, it's but the data that's over here, right? So if you look at the API, we go down data, right? Then we get into children, which is an array, and then each child is a dictionary, right?
So, but the dictionary doesn't have a name. That's what was confusing. And then when I tried to make it by the array,
Because the dictionary doesn't need to have an array, because each dictionary here is a number in the array. So to
Right.
reference a dictionary, it's array index.
we were just trying to when I tried to reference the index number.
Okay, so let's jump to that. Let's jump to today's. We can go back and review going down the rabbit hole, but I think this might actually clear some things out. So let's actually take a side step. There's one library we're going to be working on with called Swifty JSON, and that basically makes it so you can just, instead of checking on every step, you can just say, hey, to go down here to, for example, if I'm going to get a subreddit. Instead of doing if-lets, I can actually reference the actual place where to find it by going directly through this URL that JSON viewer gives us. So the method we're going to use to add libraries, external libraries, is called CocoaPods. And there is one scary step in CocoaPods, which will involve us working with terminal, only for like one step out of the whole thing, or two steps of the whole thing. So CocoaPods has an official website. And they've got a plethora, like pretty much library that does anything, right? From YouTube players to JSON parsers to, we're gonna go through sliders today. They've got lots of modules you don't have to recreate, right? And even popular apps that you use every day, like Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, they all use a lot of these frameworks, and they've also built a lot of these frameworks for us that we can leverage, right? Building those fancy animations for every app, for every developer would be very, very difficult. So there's tons of open source libraries we can use. So CocoaPods, it's kind of like a 3 or 4 step process. I say maybe 4 steps because we first have to install CocoaPods. But basically, we have to navigate into our project folder and run a command called pod init. And the pod init, what it does is generates a file called the pod file. And the pod file is where we list out they're called pods, right? All the plugins for our project. After we have all the names on there, the second command within terminal is pod install. So what it does is that pulls in all those libraries into our local machine, and it does one extra step for us. It creates another Xcode file, which is an Xcode workspace. And Xcode workspaces, they essentially bundle up multiple Xcode projects. You can talk to them. So CocoaPods starts a new Xcode project that basically links to all those frameworks that we brought in, and our project can reference those frameworks. So after you install CocoaPods in your project, you'll no longer open the XC project, whatever extension Xcode has. You'll open the XC workspace file. So I'll show you guys how to navigate your project folder, so you don't have to learn, the normal terminal stuff. First important step is, does everyone know how to open terminal? Huh?
Just search for terminal, right?
Yeah. So go to your search icon and type in terminal. It is. Yeah. So we'll open up my terminal. I actually already have it open. Second step is in our project. If you actually right-click on this top-level feeder file or whatever project file, you can click on Show in Finder. Then in your terminal, if you type in CD, which stands for change directory, press space. I'll give you guys type instructions for this. So CD space. And then the folder that you open from Show in Finder, drag and drop feeder onto there. And this will drag and drop the direct path to your project. Now, don't press enter yet. Because we drag and dropped this folder, this first folder here, feeder, it takes us inside there. So we actually want to go one folder back. So over here, instead of doing feeder, we just backspace into feeder. Right, so I'll do it one more time. So CD, change directory. I'll drag and drop my first folder from the project here. And after that, I can just backspace the last word and then press enter. Is everybody here?
So,
CD space.
It's not showing you.
Yeah, it's fine. Cool. One really quick command to remember when you're in here is ls, which just lists your current files in your project. And it's just important to check where you are, right? So if you do ls, list your current directory structure, it's important to check that you're in the root folder of the project. You want to be in the folder that displays your Xcode project file, right? Now this next step we're going to do now, you're only going to have to do it once, because we're just going to install CocoaPods in our machine. After we install it for the first time, we can exit from that point on. So CocoaPods is actually, just some background, is actually built-in tools. It's built in Ruby. And Ruby comes pre-installed in all of our Macs as a version, like, I don't know, 10.7 or something, 10.6 maybe. So the Ruby plugin mechanism is called Gems. And again, this is stuff that might not be requiring context from you guys, just nice to know. So we're gonna first install CocoaPods through this gem infrastructure. So we're gonna do gem install. Don't press enter yet. Let me make sure it's the right name, CocoaPods. Let me confirm. Gem CocoaPods. What's the full name here? And CocoaPods also has a great site for directions where you can really get all this as well. Okay, so gem install CocoaPods. No. And you might have to also do sudo if you know the password. They're required to enter the password. And if you start typing it in, it will not show the password, so that's okay. So type in your system password and press enter.
Sudo?
Huh?
What is sudo?
Sudo means super user do. So super user do gem install CocoaPods. So you only have to do this once.
Yeah, I gave mine the command.
Do what?
I gave mine the command without sudo. I pressed enter before you said so.
That's okay. Should be fine. Let's try one more time. Just with... Press up. If you run the same command again, if for some reason it's messed up, just press up and it'll bring up the last command in history.
Okay.
Press enter. Not typing your password, you won't be able to see it though.
My work password, right?
For your machine.
And then press enter?
Yeah. If you press Control C, yeah, press enter. Control C to cancel. Press up. Yeah, it's your machine.
Did you want to come
Yeah.
Okay. I was trying to catch the commands. Which folder were you trying to save it in?
So the feeder folder you pulled from the project. Yeah, so sync up. And then drag and drop that folder into your terminal. You good? Cool. Yeah, all good.
So I have 21 gems installed versus.
Yeah, so gems have lots of dependencies. So it's very rare that one gem, well, it's not very rare, but it's most often than not, gems will will install their gems for you because they're allowed in the plugins to work. Okay, so it's a big network of infrastructure.
So once you downloaded the gem install.
Sudo gem install CocoaPods, yeah.
Sweet.
All right, we all good? Okay, so this step will never have to be repeated again, right? So the order of events is cd into your project folder, right? And now to have CocoaPods running on here, from your root folder, again, make sure you press ls to make sure that you're in the right directory. You do pod init, pod init. So after you did that, one way to make sure to confirm that it worked is if you press ls again, you'll see that our project now has something called a plot file.
When you say we don't have to do this again, we don't have to do this again for this project, or we don't have to do this again at all?
You don't have to do the sudo gem install CocoaPods at all again. The
Okay.
pod init you have to do for every project.
Okay.
So all it does is it creates a pod file, and that's where we list all of our project dependencies that we want to bring in.
Did you just say one gem install?
Yeah, because I already had mine installed.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it should. Everyone else should have done a lot more.
And is this the same procedure when we want to install anything external?
There are some caveats where you maybe might not need to do that, which I'll go over. Which actually we might need to do today for one of the things we're going to be working with. But yeah, that's the same procedure most of the time. Now, one thing to note is we created this new pod file through pod init, but Xcode didn't pick it up. So you might have to open this pod file in a text editor. You can open it with Xcode or with TextEdit, or if you have any other kind of code editors, you might use those. I'll just open it with TextEdit. So this is the file that we get from podfile.
Yeah, that need to be more proactive. This, 'cause I was trying to catch up. So I need to, I was trying to.
Did you copy this to the folder?
Yeah, copy it, you said the link to the terminal.
But copy to your classwork folder so you don't miss it. Password and default install. Okay, so this is going to be the same procedure for almost every project. We'll be using Swift, of course, from every project on. So you uncomment, you remove the hashtag from the use frameworks. And let's also uncomment the platform. And for the platform, I'll say iOS 9 and higher. Everybody have this? And then in our target feeder, this is where we install all of our pods. So the one we're going to install today is called Swifty.json. If you go in our cocoapods.com, Swifty.json. So a few things to note. Get used to using CocoaPods because most of the iOS pod libraries are hosted on here, as well as GitHub. And there's too many things to note. Number one is if you want to bring up documentation for the respective project, it may or may not have extra besides what you see on the landing page. You scroll down to the right side where it says documentation. The second place, which is actually usually the first place I go to, is I click on the GitHub repository. So that's always at the top of the project next to the AutoCAD over here. Right? So everybody have this up for Swifty.json? GitHub Swifty.json?
You expand it?
Huh? Yeah, go into the GitHub. So if you scroll down, pretty much every pod will have, every respectable pod will have directions to install. So if you scroll down to the integration part of Swift2JSON and look at the delivery engine, which is CocoaPods, it gives us the keyword to enter here. So it says pod Swift2JSON pointing to the Git repository. So copy that into this target feeder do. Now, 2 side notes. There's 3 ways to add frameworks to our projects. Number 1, most widely used, is CocoaPods. Number 2 is Carthage, which is similar to CocoaPods. And number 3 is you can do everything manually, which sometimes might be easier, but most times not. So in our pod file, again, follow directions from GitHub, add the pod file reference in our target feeder. Right? Not in the second block, in this first block. Everybody have this? Then, so save this and go back to our terminal. And in the terminal, we will do pod install. So you should see something that says installing Swift2JSON. One point is what?
9.0 is the version of iOS that we're building for.
Yes, exactly. 9 and higher. So now, remember, what was the command for listing everything in your directory? ls. So if you do ls, we'll see we have new files in there, right?
The pod file lock.
Pod file lock, a pods folder, which is where the additional pods get installed. And also, one thing to note is pod file system is also great for working in teams, because when you share a repository, and if it's a big team, means there's tons of dependencies, which means you might have like 15 pod files, right? If you have lots of plugins. You don't want to back up your pod file, your pods in your repository, because it's not your work, right? You want your update plugin system to be updated whenever they get updates, right? So the way it works is usually there's a git ignore file, which we say folders to ignore in Git. So we ignore the pods file, and the repository we just sync up the pod file. So we ignore the pods folder. So the pod file gets synced, and then every new member that comes in, they run a pod install that installs those plugins fresh. So it's a good plugin management system. That's usually how, actually, that's how plugins are done in most frameworks, including Ruby, Node, really Java, anything under the sun. So after the pod install installs this, from this point on, we are no longer going to open this Xcode project file. The file we're going to be working from this point on is our XC workspace. So in our Xcode, let's actually go back there and let's close out our feeder project. In the Finder window we opened before, just double click to open the XC workspace file. So the XC workspace file will reference two projects again. It will be our feeder project we had initially, and then our pods project, which is our reference plugins. So after you open your XC workspace file, everyone should see something like this, right? So let's spell out the steps.
What we did?
Yeah.
Okay.
So number one, navigate or CD, right? To root project folder. Step two.
This is if we already have it on our thing?
Yeah.
Okay, then podding it.
Podding it. Okay. Step three.
The documentation for that one line of code that would be in GitHub. And paste it into our first function.
So add pods.
You have
Add
to-
pods and uncomment the stuff at the top of the pod file, right? Step four. Pod install, right? And then five is finally open XC workspace. File instead of XC project. Cool. So one thing to note is, say we added this pod file, right? And we're going to go through this stuff today. Say we added the pod file, and we want to add another pod, right? So if we want to add another pod, we go into the pod again. We essentially resume back here to just add pods. So you add another line under the target, whatever, where the pods go, and then you run pod install again. But again, this is to be every time from the project root folder in terminal, right? So CD, drag and drop the project folder in there, and that's where you're working with the pods.
Number three.
Uncomment pop-up pod file. So we have the platform version and the other line. Cool. Question in this process so far? Now there's one more step that we might need to do if we're working with a pod file that's built specifically in Objective-C. We can actually use Objective-C pod files in Swift, which we'll go over later. Or if not today, maybe definitely next class when we go over parse. And basically what we do with that is we add a bridging header, but we'll go over that. It's very technical, yeah.
If you
like closed out your terminal or did something else in your terminal, you were no longer, you still have to go back to the root folder.
Yeah.
That you don't have in there?
Nope.
Okay.
So if you already started, if you already ran pod init, you only do it once per project.
Okay.
You do pod install every time you add a new pod. So I want us to also, start getting familiar with reading pod documentation. So the Swift2JSON API or Swift2JSON pod, I'm intimately familiar with because I use it all the time. The other one that we're going to use today, I am not familiar with at all. So we're going to read through documentation together, understand the thought process of what to look for and how to implement things, right? And this is where it's going to get us thinking in terms of delegates, classes, and how to use them, right? Because you're no longer now just using your own classes, you're using other people's classes, right? So if all went well, we can now go back to our feeder project and load our view controller. And we can import the library that we installed. So we should be able to do import Swifty.json. Uh-oh.
You just put semicolon between those.
Sorry, 1 second. No semicolon. It's yelling at me because Swifty.json, it requires us to be using iOS 9 or higher, which makes sense because Swift 2.0 is iOS 9 and higher, right? So if we're going to use this library, we've got to deploy to iOS 9 and higher, right? So if we go into our feeder project, we can set deployment target to 9.0. So if we build again, there we go. Now, again, this is an Xcode bug. Sometimes if you import an external library, it might yell at you because it might need to refresh its memory. So if you quickly want to fix that, either clear your cache or just do a build, Command B to rebuild. That way it collects, it reindexes our project folder. So if you did import Swift.json and it was yelling at you, and actually it was for me because it didn't recognize the new folder structure, I just did a build and it picked it up. So just, if you're importing a library that you added to CocoaPods and it's giving an error without even doing anything, don't panic, just build. Should be a t-shirt. Don't panic, just build.
Yeah, I don't think mine got loaded.
Let's see. It's all uppercase JSON. Questions so far? Can everybody import plot a library from this point on? Right? Not super complex. Terminal is probably the most intimidating part, but it's pretty straightforward. Just CD into the folder you drag and drop, and then pod init, pod install, boom.
I would say finding the pod that we want to look for in the GitHub repository. Finding the line of code that we look for in the GitHub repository is.
It's under implementation.
Yeah, it should always be there. If it doesn't give you that line, really it's always pod and then the name of the library. So if you go CocoaPods, and that's where you're getting the name. So CocoaPods or GitHub, right? So whatever name is in there, it should be able to just paste in the pod. It'll pick it up from the main repository. Sometimes it will yell at you, so let me actually take a step back. So usually you should be able to get away with just doing this, right? Pod Swifty.json. This is what we search for. Sometimes there might be something weird in the CocoaPods library. We doesn't know what version or URL to reference. And you have to be explicit about where to get the file. So this really just points into the GitHub repository URL. Okay, so now let's come back to our project and talk this out a little bit. So we're going to be loading data when we first load our project, right? In our data load, right? We want to load our data, make the API call as soon as our table reloads, right? First thing. However, where do our cells get populated?
Outside of the muted node, so we need to create something outside of that scope.
Precisely. Yep. Very good. So we're loading our data first from here, but we've got to have some kind of variable outside of the scope to be able to reference it later, right? I'll call this Reddit data. And what this Swifty JSON file gives us, or library rather, is it gives us a new type, which is a JSON type. And this will be conditional. Right? So it's an optional because we don't yet have data, right? And this JSON type comes to us from Swifty JSON. So because our data will be structured in JSON type, it will be much easier to reference than if it was a JSON object that comes with iOS libraries.
Are you gonna provide the code for this?
I will, yeah. Okay, so we have our data reference, right? Where we're gonna insert our data. So after our data loads, we are gonna place our return where?
The variable that we just created, right?
Yep. So self.json or Reddit API, or Reddit data is what?
A typecast of a JSON typecast of data.
Yeah, actually right now we'll just do data. We'll just throw our data in there. Actually, we had to type JSON, so it's going to yell at us. So let's convert this. Yeah, you're right. Let's typecast this. It might be easier. I was going to come back to this in a different step, but let's go straight there. So we have to first, before we can do that, we actually have to do one more step. Yeah, let's come back to this in 1 second. I'll comment this out. So our usual step is we have to do something like if, let, and convert, serialize it, right? So if let Reddit JSON and we'll make this any object for now. I'll explain this in a second. We'll do ns JSON serialization and JSON object with data. And our data will be data. No. Actually, we don't even have to do any object here. Should be able to just do this right here. So this is giving us an error because it's expecting a try catch. Let's see if this does.
I was looking at the way you did it last time, and then you didn't just type in data you had.
Data, give me 1 second here, guys.
You had your options, not the you had something.
Add what?
In your options parameter, you had NS and JSON reading options.
I had NSJSON.
NS JSON reading options.
Okay.
And dot allow fragments.
That is obviously not one way to do it. Let me actually pull up our last project so I can see how we did it last time, so we don't go a million ways about it. There's networking. Yeah, so we did like this, allow fragments. Yeah, I want to keep it one way so it doesn't get confusing. So there we go. So we dump our Reddit JSON on there. And then we can actually do self.json is Reddit JSON SNS dictionary. We might have to. It's beta. All right, why is he on this? All right. It will typecast as JSON.
Basic counts.
Thank you. Okay. Everybody have this up and running? So basically, this second step is new, but this first step is exactly the same as before from last class, right? We basically have to serialize our data before we can convert it to JSON format. The way I've done it actually before is don't need to follow this just yet. We should also be able to do, yeah. Yeah, we should also be able to do this right here.
when you're choosing the NS object with data, did you choose the NS data one or the NS input stream?
The data one. So now let's just see what happens here. Let's try and print this out. Self.reddit data. And for us to be able to execute this, what's the final step?
Resume.
Yep, task.resume. So let's run this. We might get an error. Darn it.
That has to be capitalized, right? The data.
Which one?
Or no?
The what?
Never mind.
All right. Let's cross our fingers. Hope we get some good data back. Yeah. Okay. So this is expecting an NS dictionary. So there's a way to do this in one line, but I'll just do it in 2 lines. So I'll say new Reddit dictionary. Let's see where we are. Reddit JSON is Reddit JSON as NS dictionary. And then we should be able to do that. Darn it. Okay, so it's expecting NS data. The data we're passing in is I wonder if I'm just passing in too much crap here. Okay. Sorry guys, give me 1 second to sort this out. I think I had a brain fart and I did a necessary step here. Yep. I think that was it. Yeah. And let me do one more thing here. Yeah. Oh, it's because we have an optional, that's why. So one more test here. Okay, so we got that. And then one more test. And this test let us see the power of Twisted JSON. So because of Twisted JSON, we can now stack our keys, right? Instead of having to unwrap everything. Let's make sure. Yep, good to go. All right. So we actually don't need this at all. And we actually don't need this either. Yeah, so the extra step of serializing, we actually didn't need it. Brain fart.
Because serializing is something
Yeah.
our CocoaPod is already doing for us.
So the JSON already doing that, yeah. Actually, you can convert an already CocoaPod's iOS, CocoaPod's JSON object. It can also convert that, but we can just pass the data straight in there. So after we have this NSRL session, we can just typecast that to a JSON object, just passing the data in there directly. So now, instead of having to go down the pyramid, down the ladder, we can just reference the data directly. Okay. So we have our data. So for table views, what are the 3 things we need?
Cell sections and your content.
Yep. So we have sections. We have the count. So the count is, what are we counting here in our articles? So if you go in our Reddit API, what are we counting?
The indexes inside the children.
Number of children, right? So we're getting count for how many of these dictionaries there are inside children, right? So we basically have to go in our object and say, inside data, inside children, count, right? So this is where it becomes super handy. We're gonna do self dot Reddit data, children, count. You guys remember the old method would have been if let Reddit data as dictionary, bracket, if let data children as array, brackets, and then do this.count, right? This way it's all in one line. Instead of, it would have been what, 5, 6 lines? This all now becomes one reference line. So we're counting the number of children, number of articles in this children array, right? So cells is the final step for now before we go into the clicking portion of this. So with that logic, how do we reference the certain article down the food chain?
You would access your plugin array with index 2.
Yep. So Reddit data, right? Children, index path row. What's the issue here? Let's see. Oh, it's because this is passing, it's not passing back text. We have to keep going down. So under each child, for us to get in the title, we have children, then we have, where's our title?
At the bottom. Under title.
Title, right? So if you look at the URL at the bottom, we're data, children, the number, which is index path, data, and then title again, right? So data, title.
But why would it be after your index path row?
Because children and the number, so if you go over title here, you see that number over here is 4, right? But the number over there will be relative to the table cell, so it'll count each thing in our JSON object. And then one thing to note is with this JSON object, we have to, at the very end, tell what kind of data this is. So we'll say .string. So given this, we should hopefully have a title. Nil while unwrapping. So what's happening here?
So your Reddit data actually never pulled anything from the website.
So this is running when? What's the order of events here? So this stuff is happening in the background, it's grabbing Reddit in the background. But our optional up here, while the cell count is happening, this is not yet populated with data because it has not come back from the API, right? Our local stuff loads faster than that stuff, right? So over here, we have to conditionally check if our data is available. So we could do something like if let's say if jself dot Reddit data does not equal nil. We'll do that. Now, this is giving us an error because this will only run if our optional is not empty, right? So if you don't have a connection, our app will crash because we're not returning something no matter what, right? So our logic says, hey, if we don't have a count yet, what's our alternative? What do we return? Huh?
Probably just never return 0.
0, exactly. We don't return anything. If our data hasn't come back, our count is 0. Very good. So we could say down here, just return 0. Or we could put else return 0. Either way will work. So if we run this one more time, it might, I think it'll still give us an error, one more error. Or at least it'll come back as empty. So you see our data coming back here, right? Why do our cells not have data?
We connect them to
We did.
Don't we have to run the table view again?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because our local processes run a lot faster than APIs, right? So right now, our table view looks for data in our cells or in our Reddit JSON dictionary, right? And it's empty right now because it runs before something comes back to us. So after the data comes back, we just have to reload the table one more time. Because right now the count is 0, right? So where would we have to reload the data after it comes back, or reload the table?
At the end of the muted load?
Yeah, so right before, right here, right? So self dot table view dot reloads data. There's one more gotcha. Last one, last gotcha, I promise.
Yay!
What's that first headline?
What's the what?
The first headline sounds pretty terrible.
Yeah, Nestle.
No. So that actually took longer than it should have. Let me try this one more time. Yeah, a lot faster that time. So all things to consider work with data, right? Like we got to think about that when we load stuff that's conditional on data, think about the state before we pull data from an API, right? And think about what happens before and after and during that, right? So there's one more step we might have to do in here that right now it's very slow, right? If working at all. Yeah, I think it might just be an error in my table view actually. Yeah, I think it's just an error with my simulator / table view. Questions so far? Does everyone understand where we're housing our Ready data at the very top of our controller?
Say how
Why?
or why? It gets connected somehow.
It's so we can use this data throughout our whole controller, right? Through our whole class, right? Because we're loading our data from our muted load. We want to have access to the data from all of our functions, including our count function, our method rather, our cell method, right? And then our click method as well, once we get there in a second. So let's add one more field. Let's go a bit crazy. So Reddit also have number of votes, right? What was that field that we're going to use called? So I believe it is data ups, unless changed. So it has downs. Yeah, it has ups, right? So each article has a certain number of ups. So let's add a description field under our cell that just lists number of ups, just as more practice. So why don't you guys walk me through this? If I want to add a description field to my cell, how would I do that? Or detail text, right? Is a nomenclature.
So, detail text label.
Very good. So cell dot detail text label.
Question mark.
Very good. And then we'll say number of ups. And then here we'll have the actual number of ups, right? Or interpolate. Or yeah, that's the right term. So how do we access number of ups? I'll actually make it a bit easier and just say let's number of ups equals. So this one will be I want you guys to walk me through this.
So it's the same as we did before, so it should be self credit data.
Yep.
Whatever.
Children,
What's it called? Bang.
bang, yep.
And then it's data.
Yep.
Children.
Yep.
Index count row.
Yep.
And then data again.
Yep. And finally, ups, right? And then final step, we have to convert it to an int, right? So to say it's an int type.
So dot in.
Yep. Ah. So it didn't give me the subtitle, right? Because I have to just do the type to be subtitle instead of default. So I just style here default. So for the UI table view cell, we set it to subtitle. Should not be getting subtitles. And we also see number of ups right now is an optional. So let's unwrap that.
Or option click to view the documentation?
Command. Well, option is to view documentation. Command click is to take you to the code specifications. I find command click to be a lot more useful because it gives us stuff to use right there. So how much easier is this rather than the letter of going on the chain? Does this make you understand unwrapping a bit more? Of accessing values in a big chain?
Right.
Remember, this over here, this structure, is exactly the same as going to our JSON output, hovering that, and looking at the bottom display. It's exactly the same, right?
Easier to put that thing. than do all this stuff.
Well, you pretty much are just doing this. I mean, you have to first make a connection before you can access that.
So you didn't.
Right. The only difference here is that instead of having children in the Chrome inspector, it gave us the actual index number of the item in the array. In this case, we did the table index path row, right, which is the index of the article. So we have one last step with this project is to, whenever we click on one of the articles, to load the actual article in the web view, right? This is something that I'm guessing a good majority of us will use in our projects, right?
Before you move on to that, can you explain one more time why you have the table view reload data? And
Yeah.
and
So
reload?
yeah, so let's go down the whole process of the whole thing. Let's like kind of go in order of what's going on. Let's draw this out. So we have first thing, we have our read load, right? And I'm actually going to draw the master queue here. So the order of events starts from, let's go from the top down, doesn't really matter, down, up, whatever. So start from the top down. So read load, and read load runs operation, which essentially is NSURL session, right? However, NSURL session is async, right? So this starts a car right here, where this is, server grabbing data, right? That's NSURL session, right? So as soon as it runs that, its mark is completed because it's asynchronous. So next step is it starts counting, count cells, count sections, enter cell info, and load table. Right? So this runs, this runs, this runs, this runs, and this is done, and finally this happens. So the load table already happened before our data came back in our main queue. So after data comes back in our main queue, in here we say reload data when we're in the main queue. So the code that we enter inside the NSURL session, that executes whenever this comes back to the main queue. So doing the reload data basically runs this steps over again after we have this data over here.
It's saying that it doesn't have your identifier. Doesn't have the,
Is it airing out?
yeah. Oh, you know, maybe connected.
Yeah, just find that it's really for this calculator.
I have a question too.
Yeah, what's
I
that?
don't know what I'm pulling, but I'm pulling the article title. Pulling some weird comments.
So you
Whoa.
Uh-oh.
That was foolish.
I had the URL on. That's cool. Something.
Oh, no.
It was cool. I was like, why is it populating this?
Was it like gibberish or?
Yeah.
That's gibberish. It's a long time to populate.
Yeah, it does. Because at first I was like, let's say it's just 50, but no.
Yeah.
It's extra than that.
There it is.
weird. I wonder if it's when it's filtered here. Oh. Could be even some weird data. For some reason, it's pointing me to weird data.
Maybe I'm going into a different array. For the comments or story. Can work with that.
Yeah, I mean,
You're
it's
just
just,
going to,
the data is being pointed somewhere weird. I don't know why.
I'm interested in seeing what you're gonna show me.
So this is the final step. So after we have our data, we have to reload the data. Because there was the whole thing about data being available. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it was good. I had the data loaded without the thing, and I just put it in.
Okay, perfect. Cool. So final step is for us to click on our data and then take us to the web view, right? So that logic we already have hooked up, right? So if we scroll down here to our did select row at index path, right? So right now, this is a custom, this is a hard-coded URL, right?
Yeah.
So we've essentially got to figure out what the URL is for the article. So looking in our data return here, I want us to get comfortable with looking at JSON data, we've got to figure out where that reference URL for the article is sitting. So usually that's called a permalink.
The permalink leads to like the comments though.
It shouldn't, does it?
Like has the image at the top.
So I think this is the permalink right here. Let's give this a try. So reddit.com. So it's comment for a specific thing, right? And the actual article, right? Where do we want to go?
Article.
Also the actual article. Point. So URL maybe? Is that it? I think that's it. I think you're right. Yeah, I think URL is it. I think you're right. And the URL is again in the overall structure. It's articles, article data, and then URL, right?
Yeah, maybe we should take it to the permalink because you can't get back to the comments from this
Okay.
URL.
Yeah, the permalink leads us there anyway. So we'll do that for now. We can change it later. So we see how the structure works over here, right? So let's first just get the permalink. So permalink, and then we access self.reddit data. And actually, let's check if we have data at all, right? So if self.reddit data does not equal nil, permalink is self.reddit data. And then we have what? Data, children, and then index path.row. And then finally permalink, right? And then we want this in a what kind of type? So permalink here is
String already.
a string.
We want to do string.
Yep, dot string.
You still have to dot string it even though it's already a string.
Yep, you have to be explicit.
And then we have to append the beginning part of that.
Prepend, exactly right. So we have to do two things. We have to prepend the reddit.com because the permalink is everything after the domain, right? And we also have to turn it into an NS URL. So I'll say let URL is NS URL. And should be URL. Should be a string. And we'll have HTTP www.reddit.com. And then we'll do plus permalink. I'm gonna have to unwrap permalink here. Yep. And then here, since we have access to this URL, we can just do this perform with segue right next to our URL, right? So basically, we're going through the same flow of getting our data from our cell by accessing the index path. Our table views have this convenience methods that whenever we tap on something, we know the index of the thing that we're tapping on, right? So there's all of our articles. Got an error. Okay, so what's the problem? Data, children. So nil while unwrapping. So our permalink is nil here. Question is why? Because we're seeing if we have the data here. Let's see. Converting this to a string. So that's conditionally if unwrapped permalink, let's try this, equals permalink. Just trying this out. Duh. And then we don't need to unwrap it because we already have it. Okay, so it's not clicking through because for some reason our permalink is not unwrapping. Did I mistype permalink? Permalink is under data, right? So if I hover over this, we see children, data, permalink. So, permalink. Is there one more data? Yeah, that's why. So it's index path, data permalink, and not index path permalink. There was one more layer of data there. All right. Come on, baby. There we go. Boom. The Reddit page is not responsive, so it looks like total crap. But if the website was responsive,
Stupid webpage.
stupid web page. This is essentially how a lot of newspapers and social readers are and feed readers are doing their apps, right? They're just getting the initial API where they get the title and the URL, and the actual content get loaded in this web view. So our problem was I was just missing this additional layer to go down, right? Question on this?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
It's not on this per se, but I can't, how do you get the, if I'm going, I can't get the page to load up where you find the permits. Like if you,
Oh, you have to install an extension. You weren't here last class.
okay.
So you have to install an extension for Chrome called JSON View. So basically, to make our data more accessible, we import Swift, or easier to work with, right, through the Swift to JSON library. We import Swift to JSON to our class, and we typecast our data to this JSON type, right? And whenever we get the data back from an SQL session, we pass it to the JSON type. And this serializes it and lets us exit in a flat architecture as opposed to going down the multiple layers. Questions, thoughts? I think it's pretty exciting. We're moving the API. We created our own feed reader. It's a pretty big milestone. Cool. So we'll work with one more CocoaPod before we break today. Let's take a quick 5-minute break. That second part should hopefully not take us as long. I'll post this on GitHub before we move on so we can have a reference point.
Thinking some weird things, man.
Yeah, it's really weird.
And then I click on the first one, it's called Box. And it takes me, asks me if I'm over 18. At least you want me to work computer to do it.
Nice. You should definitely click on that.
You're creating a form reader for iOS. Yeah.
My battery is slowly deteriorating. It used to last all class. Thank you. Oh, it's a different plug.
Oh.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about
Do you guys have a plug you can borrow? You have a spare plug? Thank you. We've got some plug lying around. Appreciate it. Oh, no worries.
that. So Keith and I are oriented by work. It's going to be a combination of basically think karaoke.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
I think I, well, this is the last
okay, I actually
one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I was like following along. I was like, oh. So weird. I don't have it.
Okay. Yeah, ours is pretty much just gonna be an audio video where you're gonna get a recording of the song. And we're still holding it down, but recording of the song and activating the show front facing camera. So you can record not only the voice but your face, and then you can do it. Save the recording and shoot it off to one of the social media sites. The other component is doing an analysis of the voice. I don't know if you're all his component. He wants to do recording of the things like you're doing, like writing, whatever. Mine was recording it and comparing the voice to another, like the actual song itself. To see what it means.
It's kind of like, Guitar Hero. How is that?
Yeah, but the vocal record. Yeah, I guess so to say.
Right, 'cause they have like that, I don't know what it's called, the Game Star.
Right. It's a, we do the extension,
Do what?
install an extension for that.
The extension for, sorry?
So I can see that the files are from links on GitHub.
Ah, yeah. So I gotta use Chrome though.
Okay.
Yeah, to download Chrome and go to extensions and then just find JSON view. Thing. So one click install. All right. All right. So let's close Feeder. Let's use a different project. I posted a solution to the students project a while back. Let's see. I think I did, right?
Your digital view controller that had students, yes.
Yeah. That one was it 15? Core data solution, yep. So lesson 15, core data solution students. So let's copy the students solution into another folder and open it up. So I'm just copying desktop for now. Students. It's here. So Javi, we're loading up the students project from lesson 15. So copy that solution from that folder into classwork.
So the one yours.
Yeah. So right now, the solution basically allows us to add students and save them with core data, right? Those solution with the last class. So I'd like to add a plugin or some kind of functionality that right now we see students listed in table view, right? I'd like us to have the students listed kind of like in Tinder view where we could swipe through each of the students. So there was a plugin I found and didn't really experiment with, but we'll get to go through the process of kind of reading documentation and like getting familiar with things and quickly installing stuff. So let's first add CocoaPods to our students project. So I want CD and drag and drop the students project in here. If you do ls, we should see our students.xcode project. So how do we start our CocoaPods in here? How do we add it to our project? Pod init, yep, pod init. And then we open up our pod file. And we'll uncomment the platform. Gonna make it iOS 9 for now. Uncomment use frameworks. And then the CocoaPod I found, cocoapods.org, was a easy swipe color. So if you click that, again, it's your preference. I like to usually go on the GitHub page. For me, it's cleaner to read, and usually most of the comments are there.
And when you're dragging the folder in,
Yep.
you're dragging the whole student's folder, right?
Exactly, yeah. A mixture in root. So when you press ls, you see your Xcode project in there. And in our pod file in our reader, we had something like this. We had pod, 50JSON, and the actual location, right? So we'll do the same thing here. We'll do pod easy swipe controller. One thing you'll notice is in GitHub, it just says this without the Git pointer here. I like to usually add that just in case. It might or might not, because the other, if you don't have it there, it might give you an error. I like to be safe rather than going back and changing stuff. So just paste the URL for the Git directory. So target students, pod, easy swipe controller, which is you should see in your GitHub documentation. And main difference there is mine just points to the Git repository. You might not need to. I just like to have it there.
What do you usually do to define these?
In the GitHub repo, it says that.
No, I mean, like easy swipe controller.
Oh, so you could go on Google and look for top CocoaPods. There's a bunch of sites which parse these. Most popular CocoaPods. What is pod is a great one I've used before. If you scroll down, it gives you trending CocoaPods. And Swifty.json is probably in here somewhere. Yeah, Swifty.json is up here. There's a bunch of networks that give you them. GitHub, you know, there's sites like NSHipster that mention them. Search online for, you know, I would search by functionality rather than just going to an all-inclusive. Okay, so we have our pod. So what's the next step? Pod install, very good. Pod install.
Why not just do the manual install?
So manual install usually, so it depends on the project, right? If the project you're pulling in is just one file, which in this case it is, you can literally drag and drop the file into your project. I like to do it in pods because many projects are a lot of files, not just one file, and it might have assets. And then you might have to do the same thing for a whole bunch of projects and just keeping them up to date, you know, removing. It's just a lot more structured this way. But if you're only using one CocoaPod or one external plugin and it's only one file, it's the same thing as just drag and dropping it to your project. Okay, so the pod install, and if you press ls, we have our workspace, right? Let's go ahead and open our workspace now. So our students.xc workspace. gives us, again, these two things, right? Our main project and our pods. Oh. So let me run this to make sure our project just works out of the box. Yep.
I can't find the page.
This link right here.
Yeah.
So if you go to GitHub and then go at the top of the page, you'll see right there the HTTPS clone URL.
That,
Yep, that's the one.
but don't you, is there more code at the beginning? Because the last one we just cut and pasted.
Yeah, so in this one, directions told you to just do pod without the explicit pointer to it.
Okay.
I like to just point to Git repository because that's usually more up to date than CocoaPods. CocoaPods usually feeds from there.
I see, it just says,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, if we run our project, we have our data, right? So we can add something and say Bob, and Bob is from New York. You can do open and start typing the name, and it'll open it in Xcode by default. So you can also autocomplete names. So you can say open, start typing students, and press tab, and then XC workspace, XCW, and press tab, and it autocompletes it for you. So if you run this, everybody should see some form of this, right? You can add new students. And it'll save them, right? And what's happening here, just to review this project, we have a table view controller that's sitting in a navigation view controller. And the plus opens up a dialog which lets us enter the information. Through delegation, it brings it back to our main controller, and our main controller saves it to core data, right? And we also have a data place where core data is being stored. So let's quickly look through documentation together for how this thing works. So what it does is it gives us, just looking at the name, is it gives us a controller type. You know how right now we have, if we go in our view controller, we have our UI view controller, we have UI table view controller, right? Everyone's familiar with? Right, everyone knows these by now, like the back of their hands, right? So this gives us an additional view controller called Easy Swipe Controller. And there's two ways to go about implementing it. You could make it so it loads it automatically at the beginning of your app, or you can make it load as a secondary, like load on an action, right? I'd like to do the latter because the example here only gives us the former, I think. So if you just go through this really quickly, this gives us the documentation for how to add this to our root view controller. But we see that what's happening here is it basically tells us to create a new controller file, and we subclass our Easy Swipe controller, right? So this looks very familiar in that it's just like a UI view controller. When we're importing UIKit, we have our view controller, and we're inheriting, right? So far, so good. Now, what's happening here, though, is because this view controller is it's only loaded programmatically. So this is kind of a new subject, which was covered in passing before, but not in huge detail. Is we're actually creating the view controller programmatically. So the way it seems to be working, look at the code here. Let's digest this really quickly. Hands away from your screen. Hands away from the screen. Is we have a new controller, right? So let's call it students swipeable VC, right? It's inheriting from this easy swipe controller we brought in for our project. And it looks like it's requiring us to set up view, right? So this is just boilerplate code. And it looks like most of the functionality is happening through this extension format. And basically, in this kind of view controller data, it's kind of a read load for this new type. It's creating a new controller. So, let redVC is UI view controller, right? So it's programmatically creating that. And then it's returning all of our controllers that are selectable in an array. So we create new controllers for all of our data that's selectable in an array. So in our case, we're essentially, instead of doing this hand by hand, we're gonna iterate to all of our students and create a view controller for every student. So we're not gonna create any new views for this. What we're gonna do is, whenever we hit a button, an action, we're gonna come to this view controller that has all this logic. So let's create a new file.
Are you getting the student file with student look? There's
I
student.
screwed up when I
What's happening?
My students file is blank. Like, there doesn't have students in it.
You can check the students.
Oh, do I need to add students?
Yeah.
Oh, I need it. You
Yeah,
add
it's core
students?
data. Your core data has no data right now.
Oh,
What's wrong with this?
I screwed up something in my path, or when I did it, I need to start over.
there's 5 students?
Because I had copied the solution, the wrong folder into lessons and password, and set my directory wrong.
Oh, no, yeah, that's just the logic.
Can you do?
Okay, I messed up, so I'm just gonna follow it along. I got the concept.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll post this up anyway. So add a new file, which will be our new controller. Okay, so we should have got this new file. So just like we did with our Twisted JSON, we're going to import our external library, and that's easy swipe controller. Let's also make sure before we do anything to set our deployment to 9 so it doesn't yell at us. And then our student swipe controller is going to inherit from our easy swipe controller data source. Right, this is what GitHub is telling us. Sorry, from easy swipe controller. Our next one is data source. And again, looking at our example over here, we don't need all of those methods that UI view controller gives us. We just need this setup view. So we can remove all this craft over here and just replace it with override setup view.
Can you cut and place directly from GitHub?
Yeah. Again, this is for interest of time. You should normally not cut and paste. You should write out the code.
Wait, what?
You should normally write out the code and not cut and paste it
To understand it better.
to understand it better. Yep. So our documentation here is basically saying, and we're cut and paste again because we're going over in time, is saying that we need to also, on top of specifying the class, do an extension of our class here. So I'm going to copy paste this, and then we're going to extend, instead of my swipe VC, we're going to student swipe view controller.
It's still within the student web view controller, right?
Yep. Now this extend functionality here, remember we went over extensions in classes a while ago. Not all plugins will have necessarily an extension. This is just how the architecture for this thing. So for the purpose of this class, I'm not going to add our student data. You guys can do that for homework, so you can play this a bit more. I just want to get this running for now. So I want us to get over here from one of our view controllers, right? So right now, if I run my program, let's figure out a place to link to from our project. So where can we link from? We have a link here, a link here. For now, I'm going to take the easy way out and just have a button here. My recommendation for homework is replace the data that appears over there with our student data and make it clickable from each one of these. You guys have the tools to do that. So in my storyboard, I'm going to add a button to my Add Student controller and call this go to slider. And then finally, after we have it hooked up, our go to slider should load up our view controller. So we can do that through a present view controller method that we've used before. And we reference the view controller we created, right? So we called that student swipe view controller. And this will be animated. And completion nil. Present view controller. So basically, we are referencing the view controller directly from here. So let's test this out again. Order of operations here makes no sense in real world, right? I just want us to go over the example so we can build on it later. So students I get to the screen that links us, show me the slider, and now we have the slider with these view controllers that are swipeable. Pretty cool,
Where the Pokemon?
right? It's your job. So we get Tinder-like functionality here to drag between our view controllers. This is how Tinder is basically built.
There's no pod for like author nomination?
I'm sure there is. Yeah, I'm sure there is. I mean, it could be one of the lessons we also do by hand. You know, we could do that in one class. That's a pen gesture, which basically is a gesture that measures where your screen is in the window. And all that happens is basically every time you drag, you get something that updates your location. And you basically just get that view to just follow wherever the finger is. That's how that works. So it's nothing that we shouldn't be able to handle in one class. So I'll post the survey for additional topics on Wednesday, because after Wednesday, we have, I think, 2 more classes, which are required, and then the rest of them are up to us. Cool. So this is not required, but for the ambitious, for homework, make it so when you select one of the table cells for students, it takes you to that easy swipe view controller, and it takes you in the appropriate path of the student. And they can go back and forth between students depending on the order. And then load the student information on that card that you're swiping through. So I'll have a solution for that Wednesday we can go over, but I highly encourage playing around with it. Questions? Thoughts?
If we want to add more colors to this, we just add more variable.
So right now, all the data is static data, right? So you only have 3 view controllers data by hand here. But you should make those view controllers be created based on some kind of data model you have. So based on the student's count, for example. So instead of doing let red BC equals view controller, you say for students in students whatever the students, and then you let BC equals controller, and it creates a view controller for every student.
So instead of a table view, it's a view. What?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, we're free to modify this extension however we need.
Exactly. That's all your logic goes in, is the extension portion. How do you guys feel about CocoaPods? Do you feel like you could bring in a new CocoaPod and integrate into your project?
I think so.
Cool.
It's a matter of understanding the documentation like we did with this one.
I don't like using this one because I've used it before. Usually it might take a bit more poking around and Googling. But it's okay, it's important to understand that that's what it takes. Not all documentation is good. This one seemed okay, but actually this one was not great because it gave us code examples, which is super important, but it didn't really guide us on what that shell means. Cool. That's all I have for today.
And as far as our final project scope, should we be putting our data online?
Yeah, put it in GitHub for sure. Back with that.
No, I mean, say one of our apps tries to access a database
Oh yeah.
that has certain information.
Yeah.
And since we know how to parse the information from an API and everything, I guess it's the only way we have to access data from our app, right?
Yep. So depends, right? If it's external data, API data like this, then we don't have to have our database. If it's your own data, which for your project it is, then you can have a central database. And that's what Pentclass is.
Okay.
It's how do we build a database online without hiring a development team, right? How do we build it back end without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars? Great.
homework, we have, what is the one for Wednesday?
So the one, it's core data. Or the persistence. Persistence.
Right, so from class 15?
Yeah.
Okay, and then for this one is due,
I'll post this up on Wednesday as well. This will be due the following Wednesday.
okay,
Our schedule is bit messed up because of the Wednesday.
What's the path forward of this, the setting from?
What's the that?
How do we get there?
Have you Googled?
I Googled, I wanna Google some more before.
Okay, yeah, Google some more, and I can post it in some Slack.
yay.
It's not too dissimilar from the main bundle.
Okay.
Cool.
Nice. Finish it.
Of course.
Hey, hey,
This.
hey, I'm literally just getting out of class. Say it one more time.
It's just, it's like, it might be